Welcome once again to the Modern Diplomacy Podcast. This is Dr. Matthew Croston, and the thing I want to discuss today is what I have come to call the Great NATO Mistake. I can still remember back in the late 1990s when I was but a young whippersnapper of a graduate student. 1997, 1998, 1999, when there were brief but serious conversations about the idea of extending an invitation, possibly extending an invitation to Russia to become a member of NATO. I was fascinated by this idea because I believed it would potentially diplomatically, in a peaceful sense, kill two birds with one stone. Not only would it sort of make Russia now beholden to the rules and regulations and orderly, proper behavior standards and structures of NATO, by doing so it should ostensibly alleviate the potential for conflict and tension, Cold War style, in Central and Eastern Europe. So before any invitation was given to any country in Central or Eastern Europe, which would by default be considered a provocation by the Russian Federation, let's be honest, it seemed incredibly logical, incredibly powerful, and innovative to extend that first real NATO invitation to Russia. But that invitation never came. That invitation got swept to the wayside because the powers that be within NATO simply couldn't understand such a radical maneuver of innovation in terms of its reason for being. After all, NATO's real, true reason for being was always the simple fact of blocking the projection of power and the maneuverability of the Soviet Union. Now, without the Soviet Union, it faced what I always used to call in class the World Bank problem, the World Bank conundrum. The World Bank, people often forget, originally came into being because it was meant to rebuild a devastated and destroyed Europe in the aftermath of World War II. This was an admirable goal, a fantastic goal indeed, and one that was actually achieved. By the mid-50s, the World Bank could laudably stand back and say, we have done well. Western Europe is rebuilt. The destruction of World War II is now over because of what we have done and how we have assisted in that transition. But then they were left with a great conundrum. What do we do now? Because it forgot, in formulating its great mission and its great overview, that the number one purpose of any institution and organization in the modern day is first and foremost self-preservation. And it gave itself originally a goal set that was achievable, but nothing coming up behind it. So the World Bank sought out, what do we do? What is our next goal? What is our next mission? And they thought of something that was absolutely brilliant, because the next mission goal of the World Bank would simply become development. The reason this is fantastic is because it is an eternal goal. It is a mission that can go on in perpetuity because there will never be an end to development. Somewhere in this world there will always be some country, some people, some region that still needs further development, still has opportunity to achieve. The World Bank showed the world back in the mid-50s how every international organization needs to behave. And NATO never learned that lesson, never paid attention to it. So when the Soviet Union dissolved, it suddenly throughout the 90s found itself wondering, who are we now? What do we do now? The idea of trying to subsume and incorporate the Russian Federation into NATO was too radical a move. These people wanted to exist, but they didn't want to change. And so we have now spent nearly a generation taking every maneuver, every action, every piece of behavior from the Russian Federation that can be portrayed in an adversarial or negative light. We have maximized the effect of that adversarial behavior. Why? Because it creates the need for a NATO. And it creates a need for a NATO that demands no change whatsoever. All we need to do on the letterhead is simply remove the name Soviet and stick in the adjective Russian. And we just continue on doing what we're doing. What I've always wanted to do is wonder if the urban planning, contemporary urban planning in America has a very fascinating new theory of development, which I think NATO should have adopted back in the mid-1990s. Let's just take a hypothetical major city called Cityville. They've reinvigorated the downtown. Once an area of decrepit, loss of jobs, loss of people, loss of opportunity. No one would go down there. It was a dying, decaying center. They reinvigorate it, a rebirth that happens all over the United States now with these major investments into the inner cities, the major downtown areas of major cities. But what happens is, just outside of that center of Cityville will be the same poverty, crime, lack of development, lack of opportunity. Well, instead of doing little gradual, step-by-step concentric circles outward from the center of Cityville, someone came up with an idea in urban planning, which is, let's overshoot our mark. Let's go, say, this one really, really bad area outside of Cityville. Let's call it West Cityville. We'll go put a major development project in West Cityville. And what will happen is the prosperity and the development will feed back into the center from West Cityville. So all that area that we jumped over from Cityville Center to West Cityville will eventually be subsumed and incorporated into the development and the prosperity, so that we have entirely now an entire section of Cityville that is developed in mass. That is exactly what NATO should have done. It should have overshot Central and Eastern Europe, found a way, any way possible, to include in its membership the Russian Federation, and then watch over a generation how peace and prosperity and development and unified behavior, parameters of proper diplomatic and military behavior, would filter back towards Western Europe from Russia, through Eastern Europe, through Central Europe, and then we would have a completely unified European continent, instead of what we have now, which is a 2017 that every day goes by seems to make us forced to think more and more that we're in 1967, as if 50 years have passed, and yet 50 years have not changed at all. That is the great NATO mistake, to not realize that all they needed to do was look at contemporary American urban planning and apply it to themselves diplomatically. Deal with it, people. That's the way it is.